When I was in seminary, I did clinical pastoral education. Basically, I had taken a few classes and I had read a few books and I knew a few things. So they took me and put me together with some other people who had taken a few classes and read a few books and knew a few things. And they put us under the supervision of some other people who had taken a few more classes and read a few more books and knew a few more things. And we became student chaplains at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in downtown Chicago. I need to almost immediately do a little aside here. I owe it to some colleagues to do a little aside here. There are some state governments. Iowa, I think, is among them. At least it's been proposed. I'm not sure if it's passed and become law, but there are some state governments that have suggested putting chaplains into schools. And there's probably some argument and debate to be had about that, but I want to say this. Real actual chaplains, people in hospitals, people in the military, people who serve fire departments and police departments, folks who are chaplains have worked really hard to become so. They have master's degrees. They do additional units of clinical pastoral education, often a whole extra year at their own expense. They go before boards to be certified. They get ecclesiastical endorsement from their denominations, from their churches, saying this person can be a chaplain. They've taken the classes, they've read the books, they know the things, and they are willing to serve everyone and minister to everyone of their own faith, of any other faith, and of no faith, without proselytizing, without trying to convert. Being a chaplain is a profession. And my problem with these proposals from various states is that they want to put chaplains in schools with no expectation that they have done any of those things. That is like putting teachers in schools who have done nothing to learn how to teach. It's like putting nurses in schools who have done nothing to learn how to nurse. Chaplains are professionals. And we should treat them as such. And we should respect them enough to not call other people chaplains and just throw them in. I had to say that. I've got friends who are chaplains. I owe them that. And I need to say that when I was at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, I was not a chaplain. I had taken a few classes and read a few books and knew a few things, and I was a student chaplain with other student chaplains under the supervision of real, actual chaplains, ministering to the folks at that hospital. The deal was that we did one 24-hour shift each week. 24 hours where we were available to any patient or doctor or nurse or other healthcare professional or staff member at the hospital for any of their spiritual needs. And that usually meant that we had a little list of people who, when they had come in, had requested the chaplain, and we would go around and see them, and then we would get calls whenever else. One evening I was called to the ICU. That's where I spent most of my time. That's where I got called most often. And not that the ICU was great, but it was better than being called to the emergency room or to labor and delivery. So I went to the ICU. And I did what I always did when I went to any unit in the hospital. I checked in at the nurses' station because the nurses know what's going on. So I went to the nurses' station and I said, I'm the chaplain. I was called to see the patient in room whatever. What's going on? And the nurse who was there told me. This woman who was in the room had been at home in her apartment, and she had heard a knock at the door. She looked through the peephole and she didn't know who it was, but she wasn't worried, so she opened the door. And then this person beat her within a half an inch of her life. That's not the kind of thing that normally happens in Chicago, but it's the kind of thing that can happen anywhere. And now she was here. She wanted to see the chaplain. She wanted to see someone who had taken a few classes and read a few books and knew a few things. And so I went in and I introduced myself. We chatted just a little bit. How are you feeling? Kinds of things. And then she asked, why did this happen? I don't care how many classes you've taken, how many books you've read, how many things you know. No one has an answer to that question. Certainly no one has a satisfying answer to that question. I certainly did not have a satisfying answer to that question, and if I were there today, all of these years later, I would still not have a satisfying answer to that question. Other than to say sometimes the world is horrible and broken, and I don't know. But in this moment I can pray. I'm telling you this story because in our reading today, there's a father who is in a similar situation. He's come to Jesus with a son who is sick, and I cannot imagine what it is like to have a child who is sick, and I cannot imagine what it is like to have a child who is as sick as this child. Since he was little, he's had seizures and blackouts. He's been thrown into the fire and into the water. It is like he has a spirit that is trying to kill him. And the father doesn't ask, why did this happen? But he says to Jesus, who has gained a reputation for going around and healing people, he says to Jesus, if you could do anything, that would be great. And Jesus says, if I could do anything, anything is possible for one who believes. I'm not quite sure how to feel about that. I mean, I know that we are taught anything is possible for one who believes. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can command a tree to get up and walk into the ocean. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. But I've never seen anyone do it. Not that I've tried. I haven't told a tree to wander off. I haven't attempted to move a mountain. I just know that we are taught. We are told, if you believe, anything is possible, and then we run into the reality that it often feels like very little is possible, like nothing is possible, like we're in the ICU just asking why this happened. Like we're standing before Jesus saying, if you could do anything, that would be great. And then this man says, I believe, help my unbelief. I'm not sure how he says it. I can imagine it a few different ways. I can imagine him sobbing, speaking in desperation, I believe, help my unbelief. I came all this way. You see what I'm trying to do, help me. He could say it defiantly. I believe. I've followed the commandments. I've kept the festivals. I traveled all this way. I came to see you. So why don't you help my unbelief? He could say it angrily. He could say it dismissively. He could say it any number of other ways, but the truth of it, the reality of it, does not change depending on the tone of his voice. Many of us, including, let's be honest, sometimes me, many of us have been in that position, have been in that place of saying to God, look, I believe, I do the stuff. I do the stuff I'm supposed to do. I don't do the stuff I'm not supposed to do. I show up for worship, even when it's rainy out, even during the summer, even on holidays. And I mean the holidays where you're not supposed to show up for church. I give to charity. I love my neighbor. I do all of the things. And yet I am faced with this, whatever this might be. So I guess my belief isn't enough. My faith isn't enough. It's just this little bit that I have. So why don't you help my unbelief? Why don't you help my lack of faith? Why don't you help this empty space inside of me and do something? And in this case, Jesus does something. Jesus commands the spirit who is hurting the man's son to go. And it goes. And after things get worse, they get better. And I know it doesn't always work that way. We are today starting a new sermon series about doubt. Because doubt is a real thing. Uncertainty is a real thing. Unbelief is a real thing. You take the most faithful saint, unbelief is a real thing. And it's something that we don't talk about often enough. Like I said, we often teach that if you believe hard enough, if you have enough faith, if you do enough, then everything will work out. And if it doesn't, then you can rely on your faith to see you through that. Somehow you'll be okay. But the reality is that it doesn't always feel that way. The reality is, it is not always that way. The reality is that sometimes we are left saying, why did this happen to me? And the point that I want to make now, and the point that I'm going to come back to again and again through the next few weeks, is that our faith takes that seriously. In this moment, we get the raw truth. I believe, help my unbelief. And Christ is there. And Christ responds. Christ's heart is moved. And after things get worse, they get better. Scripture is full of those stories. And Scripture is full of those times when things get worse and they don't get better. Unbelief is not an enemy of our faith. Doubt is not a threat to our faith. It is a reality of the human condition. It is a reality of who we are. It is a reality of how a broken world works. But even in our deepest doubts and our darkest moments, we are not alone. God does not leave us just because we doubt. God does not leave us just because we are unsure. And in those moments where we want to find someone who has taken a few classes and read a few books and knows a few things and ask them, why is this happening? Well, we can do that. or we can address God. We can address God, God's self. We can address Christ. We can say, why is this happening? And I don't know if we'll get an answer. But I know that even in that moment, Christ will hold us and care for us and comfort us and help our unbelief. And I know it seems a strange thing to say in this kind of moment, but sometimes that is enough. Thanks be to God.